Variables affecting police brutality in America. The pandemic hit America in a way that it hit no other country. Age-old problems sort of rose from the ashes with a completely new agenda. The problem was police brutality, and the agenda were protests. I theorize that the cause of this police brutality is the inherent racism and racial segregation that has been used throughout this country from the beginning. In this experiment, I will be using content analysis and a mock direct observation to study the effects of racial segregation and the issue of police brutality to see the exact correlation between the two. This is the literature review I used to help back up my experiment and the facts in it. The first source, Lee, relates neighborhood crime levels to police force. Their current study is being used to look at the relationship between areas with lower levels of violent crime and those with higher levels of violent crime to see if there is a difference in the police brutality ratings that has to do with violent crime levels. SOS shows that political presence and the relevance of marginalized communities inquires into government control, and they also look at how it differs in non-marginalized communities. Holmes looks at the minority threats and relates them to legal mechanisms of crime control, and it really looks into the why are minorities seen as more of a threat to officers than the majority would be. Gross looks at social inequalities, predicting crime rates, worrying that movements like the Black Lives Matter movement force officers to scale back on the way that they police areas because they're too scared to be incriminated for using quote unquote police aggression. The next paper by Lee kind of bridges the gap between contextual reasons for police violence and the lack of training leading to police violence. I think that a lot of these sources really help to hit the nail on the head with police violence and seeing that American police officers need more training and they need to understand how to handle these situations in these areas where it is a minority and you do feel different and fearful, but it is something that you need to understand how to work with. My main theory is that racially segregating a city promotes poverty and a heightened crime level, which then instills more fear into a police officer when they are trying to protect the area. And I think that this makes racially segregated cities more apt to police violence because of the fear that society and the high crime rates instill into these police officers. So that leads me to my main hypothesis, which is the more racially segregated the city is, the higher level of police violence. And my second hypothesis is the more racially segregated the city, the higher level of police violence, especially when crime rates are high. The unit of data I would use for my statistical method is the population of the 100 most heavily populated cities, and I would use the entire population. My main variables I would test are racial segregation of the city, which would be tested as an ordinal variable. I would organize and compare the cities from least to most segregated and compare it to the rate of police violence in each city. I would also be testing the rate of police violence in an interval or ratio form. I would compare the police violence charges with that of the most 100 populated cities and rank them from least to greatest for my research. And the last I would test is crime rate in an interval ratio way. I would compare both crime rate of the cities and the racial segregation to police violence to see if there was a correlation between the three. My control variables are ethnic diversity, average income, population, police funding, and police per capita. I feel like all of these have a very important role in each city, and each city is different, but they do matter when you're trying to do research on something that's so involved with the police force. So for the rest of my statistical analysis, I chose to use content analysis. My operationalized variable would be police violence. This would be what I would be testing for. I would use complaints, lawsuits, and newspaper coverage on police violence in 2019 with a substantive content analysis. I would use a category frequency chart to find all of these complaints and lawsuits and newspaper coverages that have to do with police violence. And my unit of analysis would be the theme of this content analysis. My secondary method that I chose to use is direct observation. I chose the cities Kalamazoo, Michigan and Dearborn, Michigan because they are very similar in population, but where they differ is their rate of racial segregation. Kalamazoo is one of the least segregated cities in Michigan, and Dearborn is among one of the most. I chose to do a ride along in each of my projected cities, one every day for a week, Monday through Friday, and I would record behavioral observation and data of the treatment of minorities against the majority to see if there are any differences between the two. I would do each of these ride alongs for a week in each city and record the results. I think that the expected findings from my experiment would be a difference in officer attitude towards people in segregated cities or the non segregated cities. And I think that my hypothesis would also be confirmed because all of my data from my literature review backs it up. And if I were to do this experiment, I'm pretty sure that it would also back up the data that I've collected over these past couple weeks. I think that my next step would to do to my next step after my experiment would be to write a scientific journal describing the experiment and what I've learned and what I've found from each of the cities because I feel like there's not a lot published on this specific problem. As I stated before, the experiment should take around 2.5 weeks. The researcher would be getting paid $39 per hour for 14 days of work. 14 days of work, it would be rounded up to $1,000. Travel for hotels, gas, and food over the next 2 weeks for that researcher would be around 1,000. Other employees like content analysts and coders would be getting paid around $16 an hour, which I rounded up to 1,000 just in case some extra expenses happened. Software expenses like photocopies and other things that might be printed or needed, I rounded up to $500. So my rough estimated total is $3,500 for the entire experiment.